starting out that I'm thrilled to be with you. I had planned to be with you a year ago, and by the time we're done with today's talk, you'll understand why it took me an extra year to be with you. You know, uh, I'm in your age group, and I look forward to learning from you about the joys of being a Maritime and retired both someday. But you'll see, I think, from the talk that the kind of work I do is so enjoyable. It's hard for me. It's hard for me to want to go through that transition. So maybe Barbara Parker will be my mentor, as she has been in the past, in one day deciding to become a Maritime. So in the meantime, let me share with you some 20 years of research, but really in a pretty abbreviated way on not everything we've learned about longevity, but just some selected things that I think you might be interested in knowing about. I'm an epidemiologist, so I'm going to start off with the big picture of what's going on in our country. But I also want you to appreciate some of the material that we're talking about in a more personal way. So I'll be flipping back and forth between those two things. So what we're going to do today is look at the definition of longevity, think about uh, think about what's most important in living long, if that's even anything you desire. Look at the life expectancy trends in the United States, which is really pretty remarkable and very recent data that you should know about. And then give you three examples of things that we think about every day in how we live our own individual lives. And I want to show you some of the data to guide your thinking about these three risk factors. And there are obviously many more, but these are ones that I think are three of the main ones that get talked about today. One question is, should you lose weight to live long? Question two, do you have to exercise hard to live long? And example three is, what about social isolation and loneliness? And then I want to briefly touch on, can we predict longevity accurately? And talk about where we're going in the future. Sorry, in this area. I have a picture of a labyrinth here. And just a remarkable image of a sacred symbol in many traditions dating back to the Greeks. I'm sure some of you know way more about this than I do, symbolizing a life's journey. And some say that in the history of labyrinths, it's a maze. Others say a maze where you can walk down one path and hit a dead end and not get where you're going. And others say that the labyrinths were never a maze, that that you're just following a path that you're definitely guaranteed to get to the middle of, but a nonlinear path. And so metaphorically, I like to use this imagery because as we've learned scientifically about what's most important in longevity, it definitely feels like it's a nonlinear path to the center. Please feel free to interrupt me with any questions in the chat. I don't know if that's done. There are a lot of you out there, and but I'm happy to stop and answer some questions. So along the lines of, can we predict longevity, we have here Dr. Thomas Pearls, who has been studying centenarians for a long time. And I invite you to just write this, to type this into your phone or your computer. And while I'm talking today, consider the cognitive double tasking of, if you like, calculating what your predicted life expectancy is. How old will you get before you die? And then at the end, I'll talk more about this in terms of prediction. I don't have to give up too much personal information to do this. And but it's totally voluntary, obviously. So wanted to start out with talking about longevity versus health span, which in gerontology is something we always differentiate. The meaning of longevity is really just long life. And health span takes into consideration how well we are as we get older. So you can see in panel A on the right that this is a person who's um, going to die fairly young, and they have a portion of their life that they've lived in relatively good health, and when it falls below that horizontal line of percent function, the idea is those remaining years in the red are being lived with functional limitations, disease, and disability. And so the space of the red is kind of what we're comparing here. Um, Everybody wants the situation in panel C, which is optimal health span, where you are able to be functional, avoid most diseases, and do everything you want to do without disability. And then you have a rapid period of decline and very little time spent at the end of your life before you die at an old age. That's what we all want. But the most common way that we're going in America anyways is panels A and B. And in panel B, you have equally long life as the person in panel C, but more time spent at the end with functional limitations, disease, and disability. The World Bank defines healthy longevity as a state of good physical, cognitive, and social functioning throughout a person's lifespan. So physical, cognitive, and social functioning are recognized as all important during the years that we're alive. Now that is odd. Here we go. So what I'd like you to do, if you would, and I'm sort of into a little bit more interactive talks, is thinking about your own health span. What is most important to you as you get older? Are you allowed to type into the chat?
Yes.
Okay, I can't see it, but would you be willing to read what gets put there in the next 30 seconds? What's most important to you as you get older?
Okay. I don't see any messages yet. People, please. Oh, okay.
Functioning well. We've got one functioning well.
Staying healthy and active. Activities with family. And from you, oh, good cognition, good brains, good body, good disposition. Laughing a lot.
Well, I think this is great. And I think this is great. And because you've brought up, obviously, many of the things that people think about. And is it important to live long at all if you're not going to be able to live the way that you want to live? So we did a survey in Seattle and 2 cohort studies back in the early 2000s. And this is what people in those 2 cohort studies mentioned. And I think you'll see your own responses in some of these comments. The one here, remaining free of chronic disease, is very difficult to achieve if you live a very long time. Coping with the challenges, sort of being able to roll with the punches, as it were, and this being functionally independent, which several of you addressed. So I bring that up just as some context to what research I'm going to show you, basically, and to the, to what extent we've considered all these things when we look at predictors of healthy longevity or exceptional survival. First, I just want to show you the recent data on life expectancy in the United States. It used to be the case that women lived actually almost 11 years longer than men in the United States. You can see here that we've been tracking very parallel with not quite that much difference. It's now like 6 to 7 years difference between men and women. And then you can see the tragic drop off with the pandemic in year 2020. The latest national data only go to 2021, but I'm sure we'll be seeing 2022 shortly. Still impacted by the pandemic, but there are some signals that this is turning around. In epidemiology and public health, we really view life expectancy and these kind of macro level changes as like taking the temperature of our whole, if our whole population is the United States of America for this purpose, how is our patient doing? And a curve like this raises significant alarm about how the patient's doing, not very well. But you can see up to the pandemic, there were at least modest gains in life expectancy through 2014, and then really a leveling off, and then the pandemic hitting, and it really taking a turn for the worse in a major way. These are the changes in disease between reasons for the reasons for changes in life expectancy from 2020 to 2021 by cause of death. And you can see the biggest thing that was responsible for the change in life expectancy was COVID. Unintentional injuries, the second most common. Everything else gets 14% of the reasons. And on the right, we actually got helped by some of the isolation that took place and had life expectancy benefited by lack of influenza and pneumonia during the pandemic, less chronic lower respiratory disease, less death from Alzheimer's disease, which is so interesting, less death from cancer, less death from Parkinson's, and then the residual. And this really may mean that the reason for death was COVID in these people. And at least for Alzheimer's disease and cancer, because I can't imagine why during the pandemic there would be less death from those diseases. So now I want to stretch your mind a little bit about
Andrea, there's an echo. I saw that you had two windows on the Zoom. Are you opened in another window?
No, Barbara, someone was unmuted. I just muted them.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. So now I want to open your mind a little further. We've looked at gender, sex gender as a differentiator of life expectancy. This is from a paper that came out of the Northeast on education, done by economists, and it looked at adult life expectancy for Americans with and without a college degree, and found these huge differences by education, absolutely enormous differences. So men and women without a college degree in America lost more life expectancy during the pandemic, but really haven't had a gain in life expectancy since 2010. And this is a macro population trend that shows how much having a college degree is associated with living longer. And then this paper just came out in the Lancet, and it's an expansion of the concept of 8 Americas. And what they did is they defined 10 Americas at the county level in the United States based on race, ethnicity, and then they factored in urbanicity, whether there was a major metropolitan area that you were living in that county. And the other things they looked at were income at the county level and disparities, sort of segregation, the degree to which Black and white people were living separately in that county. And this is what they came up with in the 10 Americas. So the red here, and we're looking at life expectancy again over this 20-year period from 2000 to 2020. The most favorable life expectancy gains were in the Asian country of America, the 10 Americas. The next most long-lived part of our population was Latinos, and they're Latinos not living in the Southwest and other counties. So and those were the two categories added when they went from 8 Americas to 10 Americas. The blue lines are the two majorly, these light sort of turquoise blue lines. I guess I can use a pointer, maybe. Let me try that. I don't know if you can see that, but so the white lines are right here. And they show a leveling off in gains in life expectancy also around the year 2010. And the dark blue lines are the white population living in Appalachia and the lower Mississippi Valley, so way below the other two white Americas. And then there were these impressive gains in the Black American groups up to about 2012 or 2013, and then this leveling off. The most disadvantaged group in the 10 Americas is American Indians and Alaskan Natives in these red dots. They experienced no gains in life expectancy over this 20-year period, and they also experienced the most horrific consequences of the pandemic. So that before the pandemic started, there was a 15-year difference between the most advantaged and the least advantaged Americas. And at the end of the pandemic, or at least by 2021 here, there was a 20-year difference between Asian Americans and American Indian, Alaskan Natives. And this is just a remarkable graph of macro trends. So is the education one. It really tells us on the macro level that what's driving life expectancy is intricately tied to education, race, ethnicity, income, and urbanicity. This is life expectancy at birth and then at age 65 between 2021 and 2022. The purpose of showing you this at all is just to say it looks like it's getting a little bit better. And I'm just showing you this by gender. It's getting a little bit better for men and women. I think it's getting a little bit better for a lot of groups, but we're far from recovered from the pandemic. So let's talk about weight and aging next. And I want to reintroduce you probably to the terminology that and the kind of way that overweight and obesity and definition has changed in our country over the years. So in 1995, we called the BMI under 25 normal range, and this has carried forward all the way to the most recent guidelines in 1998 from NHLBI. In terms of this category of BMI 25 to 30, where a lot of us live, that's been called overweight since the WHO 1995 classified it as overweight instead of normal range. And it used to be that the cutoff for NHLBI was 27.3, but this group got kind of some of the people who would have been considered normal prior were grouped into the overweight or this pre-obese group. So this 25 to 30 is an interesting group for us to look at. The BMI of 30 to 40 is really a wide span of BMI, height, weight. This is now a group classified as being obese, and if it's 30 to 35, they're obesity class 1, and if it's 35 to 40, it's 2. 40 and over is obese, severely obese, by the 1998 NHLBI clinical guidelines. So when we look at the obesity categories, it's really important to disaggregate 30 to 35 and 35 to 40. These are very different sized people, and there are many more people in the 30 to 35 group than in the sort of severe obesity group. So this is what we have going on in America in terms of terminology right now. And US guidelines have been criticized by some in the public health and policy sphere and committees. So several people including the committee member that established the NHLBI categories, expressed concern that the new guidelines open the door for widespread use of diet drugs and may unnecessarily stigmatize people. And then former Surgeon General Koop urged the panel not to broaden the definition of overweight, saying it will confuse the public and the medical community. It needlessly stigmatizes millions of Americans and lacks a solid scientific rationale. So when they're talking about this part of the distribution, it's really the category of overweight being widened to have an upper bound to include people that were between 25 and 27.3. All of those people suddenly became overweight when they changed that cut point. And it was asked at the time, is this a silver platter for drug companies? The New York Times described the new cut points as providing the pharmaceutical industry with a booming new market for diet pills and practically serving to the companies on the silver platter by the government a large marketing increase for them to make money from. And I think just recently we're talking about some of these medicines. They're experiencing a moment in the sun, if possibly a long number of years as their moment, and they may keep looking better and better or not. But right now, I wanted to show you what the data look like when we look at large populations of people and who is needing, in terms of longevity, to think about losing weight. And what you can see in this slide is we have all male subjects on the top left and males excluding deaths in the first 2 years because people tend to lose weight as they approach dying. And you've got the same thing on the right for women. And what you can see here, the dotted lines in each graph are the null value, the point of unity, where where the hazard ratio says there's no difference in the risk of death between the BMI category that's being compared. So one here, the ideal body weight is taken to be here, it looks to me like 1.0 is taken to be in the normal range at about, it looks like about 23 to 24 BMI. And everybody else is being compared to them in this graph. And you can see that the BMIs don't start to indicate elevated risk in all subjects until you get past 35. We don't even see an increased risk until almost 40. And if you look only at the healthy non-smokers, you don't see any increased risk again until you get to a BMI of close to 35. So this whole overweight range in here, I mean, these hazard ratios actually indicate a little bit lower risk than the people in the normal weight range for male subjects. And when they exclude the first 2 years of deaths on the bottom, the picture is largely the same. For women, similar. We don't see any evidence of an increased risk of mortality until women are above the BMI of 35. And even when we exclude the first 2 years of death, the same is virtually true. The same is virtually true. In fact, there have been many public health scientists in this space that have looked at this 6 ways to Sunday and always shown, that being overweight is not risky and may be advantageous. So this is a beautiful paper by Catherine Flagel who was then at the CDC, a very controversial paper not because it wasn't done perfectly well, but because the Harvard epidemiologists believe in thinness and did not want the public to get the wrong idea that it was maybe not necessary to be so thin. Do you have a question? No, okay. So what you can see is a huge number of studies here. Were aggregated to look at them individually and overall. This is for all-cause mortality, and the comparison group is people normal weight. And it's people where the studies measured the actual BMI. It's not based on self-report. And you can see that the vast majority of studies for overweight versus BMI show something either protective or very close to unity, very close to one. And there's even more studies, same set of graphs. So it just goes on. And this is all-cause mortality for overweight and obesity relative to normal weight. So combining the overweight and the obese people, and looking at measured versus self-reported weight and the combination of the two in the first set of columns there. And what you can see in this is that we don't have any signal for an association with total mortality compared to normal weight until we get to BMIs over 30 in aggregate. But then when you look separately at 30 to 35 versus over 35, all of the risk is in the group with BMIs over 35. So clearly it's not good to be a very big person with a BMI over 35, but most of us are not. Most of us are living in this comfortable space below 35. So the question I want to ask before we make any conclusions here is, what do we know if you've lost weight about survival to ages 90, 95, and 100? And here we go to the Women's Health Initiative in a paper we just recently published. And what this paper shows is that the people, here we're doing something a little different. We're not predicting mortality. We're predicting the odds of survival to age 90. Just what are your odds of survival to age 90? So if the odds ratio is over 1, that's an increased risk of survival to age 90. But if they're under 1, that's a decreased odds of survival to age 90. So what you can see here is that the people who gained weight 3 years after baseline, these are all women, had no change really in if they might have even had a decreased odds of survival to age 90, but not by much. The group that lost weight, either intentional or unintentional, had a decreased odds of survival to age 90. And those with stable weight were the comparison group. When we looked at 10-year weight change in this study, weight loss was associated with an odds ratio of 0.6, so like a 40% decreased odds of survival to age 90. And weight gain of greater than or equal to 5% was not associated with a difference in the odds of survival. So these are observational data. We didn't ask people to lose weight. This is just naturally occurring regarded as intentional or regarded as unintentional weight loss. Weight loss and survival to age 85, very similar picture. Now we're getting to the ages when we start talking about survival to age 95, where your overall odds are less. And the same pattern there. And then this is survival to actually age 100. So weight gain did not importantly change the odds of survival, but weight loss greater than or equal to 5% at the 3-year point greatly decreased your odds of survival to 100. This is many years before. And this is just the conclusions on weight. Weight loss of more than 5%, but not weight gain, was associated with lower odds of longevity. The blanket recommendations for weight loss are unlikely to lead to better survival or to advanced ages, although they may benefit management of other diseases. And the study supports the promotion of weight stability as a useful predictor of longevity in older women. So that's a nice end for you to contemplate just before dinner tonight. And thinking about, do you need to lose weight to live long? Very little evidence for that. Maybe if your BMI is over 35. I also wanted to show you this meta-analysis, very recent, of the GLP-1 and the GIP GLP-1 drugs. These are the Wegovy and Ozempic drugs. They're starting to have enough data from the trials that they've done to look at total mortality in overweight or obese adults without diabetes who are using these medicines in the trials versus the ones on placebo, and they're showing a benefit on total mortality so far. So that's, encouraging. Like I said, these are very wide confidence intervals. Only by combining all the data we have do we get a small signal here, but it's a 19% reduced risk of dying. The follow-up times are pretty short. It's something we really need to keep an eye on. Does taking Ozempic and Wegovy increase longevity? I will say the NIH is bullish on this. I think the National Institute on Aging, I think in the intramural program has scientists who are very bullish on this. But overall, 20% decreased risk of mortality in the experimental data, combined post hoc on this point. Okay, let me see here. I also wanted to mention physical activity, since I think we all believe that being more active is associated with better health and longevity, and sitting less is associated with better health and longevity. But how crazy do we have to get about this is the question. So a lot of my work over the past 10-ish years has been about what intensity of physical activity is needed to get the health benefits from physical activity. We now have devices that measure how much physical activity we do and how intense it is, much better than our self-reported questionnaires. And this particular paper that I'm showing to you was written by one of our doctoral students. And what he did is he looked at people that had good genes for living long and people that had less than good genes for living long, people who were genetically predisposed to longevity versus not. With a very few genes, it's actually not very many genes we know about that contribute to longevity. And what we showed here, and I think it's in the next slide, the hypothesis was that increased physical activity or decreased sedentary behavior measured with the accelerometer would be associated with an increased odds of surviving to age 90. In this study with intact mobility, with not just surviving to age 90 now, but bringing in the physical function component of being able to walk or climb stairs, compared to the odds of dying before age 90. And I'm gonna skip ahead here and show you that we're able to look at with the accelerometer all these different kinds of physical activity, including light physical activity, which is characterized by slow, non-intense movements like you might do when you wake up in the morning and get yourself dressed, when you do housework, when you stroll to the mailbox. Light physical activity on an accelerometer is when the counts are happening slower than intense physical activity where the counts are happening faster. So moderate vigorous physical activity had a mean in this population of about 36 minutes a whole day. Light physical activity, much more, many more hours. When we look holistically at how we spend our days, even if we're intentionally being physically active, doing exercising or anything aerobic or even lifting weights, having about a half hour of MVPA is about as good as it gets for a lot of people. But our total physical activity is a lot more if we're just active throughout the day doing household things. Sitting time is the longest thing that we do. And this sitting bout duration is another exposure that this technology allows us to look at. I'm putting dots all over the place here. There we go. So this is how the data worked out. We're looking for odds ratios over 1 to show us where the increased odds of long survival were. And if you look at living to age 90 with intact mobility, all of these compared to the second quartile, light physical activity was associated with increased odds of living to age 90 with intact mobility. Moderate vigorous physical activity was also associated with stronger odds ratios. And obviously total PA, the combination of the two is shown at the bottom. So people in the highest quartile of total physical activity are more than 3 times as likely to live to age 90 with intact mobility. And what we saw also was that there was an increased odds for these kinds of physical activity, these intensity levels with living to age 90 with mobility disability as well, but not quite as high a predictive, and why that would be, we can muse about later. But I think it has to do with, competing causes of it. It makes you live long, not necessarily without mobility disability, because you could have conditions like arthritis that limit mobility as you get towards that mark of age 90. This is the same 2 healthy aging outcomes. We're looking at steps. Counting steps was probably the strongest association that we saw. And we also saw that sitting bout duration was not associated with longevity, but long sitting was greatly. So accelerometer measured physical activity, no matter the intensity, was associated with an increased odds of survival to age 90 with or without intact mobility, while sedentary behavior was associated with the decreased odds. And the associations with survival outcomes were more pronounced among women with obesity or at least one chronic condition. I didn't show you the stratified analysis, but that is what it shows. So that's pretty promising for physical activity. But again, the bottom line is you don't have to do hard physical activity. You can do light physical activity, and you don't have to climb Mount Everest. So the third risk factor I want to talk about, also pandemic related, but generally probably not in our crowd, but very prevalent in the US population, is the epidemic of loneliness and social isolation in older people. The fact that you're here today suggests that you're not the kind of person that suffers from this problem. But as you can see on the right in this Surgeon General's report, Americans are becoming more isolated and lonely. And you can see that in 2020, there were these big increases in social isolation from the pandemic. Levels of household family social engagement have decreased. There's been a decrease in companionship, a big decrease in social engagement with friends, a decrease in non-household family social engagement and social engagement with others, hours and hours a month, according to this Surgeon General's report. And all in all, I mean, that really means that from 2003 to 2020, social isolation and loneliness, social connection overall has importantly declined in our country. This is another one of those forest plots that looks at social isolation and loneliness in relation to mortality and shows an increased risk for social isolation on the left and loneliness on the right, I believe. Pretty much very similar effect sizes. Let me just make sure. Yes, social isolation on the left and loneliness on the right. We published a paper, one of my postdoctoral fellows in 2022, looking at the hazard ratios for social isolation and loneliness with incident major cardiovascular disease, which is heart attack and stroke. And you can see here that both of them had, if you were socially isolated or loneliness, the upper half of the distribution on these two scales, you had individually increased. By that, I mean, if you had social isolation, you had an increased risk. And if you were lonely, you had an increased risk. It withstood adjustment for a large number of covariates. And if you had both, it was sort of what Loki Natarajan, who is in the Emeriti group, would call a sub-additive effect, but it's almost additive. Like they did add to each other. In some cases, like this 16 and the 11 perfectly adds to 27. This one adds to 23. So they really were additive. And that's, that these two exposures could increase your risk of heart disease is kind of an amazing phenomenon. When we look at, this slide really talks about what interventions have we to intervene on social isolation and loneliness. And there is a body of evidence here that was summarized in this JAMA Network Open paper in 2020. And it shows the wide range of interventions that were tried to intervene on loneliness, social isolation, and social support, stratified by what kind of setting it was in. And the yellow dots are community settings where people are not institutionalized. And the darker dots are are studies that were conducted in long-term care institutions. So what do we make of this? The multimodal loneliness and social support. So the studies that did more than one thing had success, it looks like. By that, we mean we have a decreased risk of the target, which the target would be reducing loneliness, social isolation, or social support. In this case, loneliness and social support, they were successful in reducing both of them significantly. And we see that social intervention for social support reduced the level of inadequate social support. Technology interventions have been experimented with quite a bit. There was one in this long-term care population that made people feel less lonely. And then this one with therapy improved social support. I don't know about you all. I think an interesting conversation is I've just started to converse with a pretty advanced artificial intelligence client. And I'm having very nice conversations with this thing, very scientific. Of course, there's lots of things to unpack in a statement like that, but I can see that the use of AI may become a compelling anti-social isolation and loneliness feature of our lives. So just to wrap up, can we predict longevity? Well, we've been trying, and I think we're at the beginning of looking at many biomarkers that may help us better predict longevity. One of the things we're trying to do is use omics, epigenetics, proteomics in particular, to some extent metabolomics, which is heavily influenced by what you eat. And genetics, for sure. We've been trying a lot to create these clocks that might be a measure of biological aging. And that area is heavily driven by machine learning. So it's pretty agnostic to specific hypotheses when it's done across a huge spectrum of biomarkers like proteins. That is to say that we are working in this area, and we will, I think, have more to say about predicting exceptional longevity in a year or two, with two studies that we're doing right now here at UCSD, one on epigenetics and one on proteomics. And the idea is to figure out which of the omics are most helpful in predicting biological age, and then learn how we can put them together to develop biomarkers that might enable us to study longevity in a more fundamentally accurate way, because you can't do a study where you intervene on people for 10, 20, 30 years. It's just too problematic, expensive, and prone to falling apart. So one of my doctoral students who's now graduated and doing important work in private industry wrote this paper as part of her dissertation, and she looked at epigenetic age acceleration using the already established biological clocks that we had at that time in relation to survival to age 90, with and without intact mobility on the top here, and with and without intact mobility and cognitive function. So we tried to bring in cognition.
He was giving this talk on what impacts longevity.
We tried,
Andrea, to the Emeriti
hey,
faculty.
Susan, we can hear you. So what we see here is these different epigenetic clocks. And so panel A is looking at survival to age 90 with intact mobility, and all four of these different clocks showed a prediction of biological age that was associated with better odds of survival to age 90 with intact mobility. When we added in cognition, very much the same pattern. Over here on the right, this is people who survived to age 90, but they lost mobility. And really none of the clocks, except for this age excel pheno, were able to predict survival to age 90 without intact mobility. But these two more recent clocks, age excel pheno and age excel grim, also predicted survival to age 90 without intact mobility. In a way, we look at if you've got a biological clock that predicts survival to age 90 with or without intact mobility, like these two, you really got a clock that can't differentiate between good health span and less good health span. So in some ways, we would love for these clocks to be able to predict the intact mobility and cognitive function phenotype, but not the other one, which indicates some kind of health problems. So let's go back to, can we predict longevity? And I'm wondering if any of you have calculated your biological age.
I tried to, but it kicked me out as soon as I was forced to put in my email and password. It said my email had been used before, and then I forgot my password, and then it kicked me out and said it was an error page. So I wanted to listen to your lecture, so I'll try it again later.
No. Yeah. Anybody else manage to get through it? It's a lot to ask, especially shooting yourself in the foot as the speaker, getting people's attention divided. Did anyone else, if we had the time, I'd say let's take a break. And when I give this talk in person, I just let people have 10 minutes to fool around with it. But I think did anyone get into the actual questionnaire and see how long it was?
Yeah, I did.
And what'd you come out with?
Much older than I thought I would live. I'm pretty healthy. I do exercise and I eat really well, and so all those questions were answered on the positive side. But it predicted me older than most of my relatives have survived. They've survived into their late 80s or early 90s, and it put me at over 100, which I don't believe.
Yeah, and it was a lot of questions, right?
A lot of questions, yes.
But not every question. I mean, obviously you can't ask every question, but it didn't ask about all the diseases. It didn't ask about how many diseases you have. There were one
Right.
has to wonder, and Dr. Pearls has never told us, how did you do this? And how was this conducted? How was this calculator made? And this is probably the most academically based longevity calculator in my awareness. And he's probably one of the most famous longevity researchers in our country. So I will just go to the punchline here, and then we'll just talk with each other and answer questions. My calculated age was 110. And then it proceeds to tell you where you can be even better. But I don't know, I don't know specifically in this report which questions I answered that were not optimized. I mean, if you get a calculated age of 110, most of your risk factors in this questionnaire are optimized. And then I'll reveal to you now that the reason I wasn't with you last year in January to give this talk is that I had been recently diagnosed with a metastatic cancer stage 4. And I was in treatment, and I couldn't finish the talk. So that's kind of the surprises along the way part of the title that I want to give you. There's no guaranteed in the labyrinth. You may be thinking you're walking towards the middle and that you can't go wrong because you've optimized all your risk factors. I think 110 does not mean I'm going to live to be 110 years old. 110 means that a lot of my risk factors are optimized because I've been living that way my whole life because I'm a risk-averse epidemiologist, And I'm going to stop sharing and take your questions.